The raging waters of the Colorado River churned violently beneath the darkening sky as Lillian Evans clutched her bedpost, watching in horror as the floorboards beneath her feet began to splinter and crack. It was the spring of 1875, and what had begun as gentle spring rains had turned into a merciless deluge that threatened everything she had built since arriving in the Arizona Territory 3 years prior. "No, please," Lillian whispered, as if the river might hear her pleas and retreat. But the muddy waters showed no mercy, rising inch by inch through her small homestead cabin, washing away the life she had painstakingly carved out for herself after her husband's death. At 24, Lillian had already weathered more storms than most women twice her age. Widowed at 21 when influenza took her husband James, she had used their modest savings to stake a claim on this parcel of land near the growing settlement of River Bend. The cabin, though small, had been her sanctuary, her promise of independence in a world that offered few paths for a woman alone. The first crash came from the kitchen as the river knocked out the back wall. Lillian grabbed her leather satchel already packed with her most precious possessions and made for the door. The water was at her knees now, brown and angry, carrying debris from upstream. She pushed against the current, her calico dress heavy and clinging to her legs. "Help." She called, though she knew her nearest neighbors were too far to hear over the roar of the river and the pounding rain. Her voice was swallowed by the storm as she fought her way to the door and out onto what remained of her front porch. The sight before her stole her breath. Where her garden had been that morning now lay a vast expanse of churning water. The river had entirely changed course, carving a new path directly through her property. As she watched, clutching a porch column for support, the ground beneath her chicken coop gave way, sending the small structure and its panicked occupants downstream. Lillian knew she had only moments before the entire cabin would follow. With a strangled sob, she abandoned her home, wading through waist-deep water toward the gentle rise of land to the west. Each step was a battle against the current that threatened to sweep her feet from under her. "God Almighty," a deep voice called from somewhere ahead. Through the curtain of rain, Lillian glimpsed the silhouette of a rider on horseback, moving toward her through the floodwaters. "Here," she cried, waving frantically. "Please help me." The rider urged his mount deeper into the flood, reaching her just as a massive section of her cabin's roof tore free with a deafening crack. The man leaned down, extending a strong arm. "Take my hand, madam," he shouted over the storm. Lillian grasped his forearm, feeling the strength in his grip as he hoisted her up behind him on the horse. She clutched his waist, pressing her face against the wet leather of his duster as the horse fought its way to higher ground. Only when they reached the safety of the ridge did Lillian dare to look back. Where her home had stood now lay only rushing water, the last corner of her cabin disappearing beneath the surface even as she watched. "Everything," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's all gone." "You're alive," the man said simply, turning in the saddle to look at her. His face was partially obscured by the wide brim of his hat, but Lillian could see he was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps in his late 20s, with intense blue eyes set in a weathered face. "That's what matters most." "I don't even know your name," Lillian said, suddenly aware of how tightly she was clutching this stranger. Vaughn Ellis," he replied, tipping his hat slightly despite the rain still falling around them. "I was heading to town when I saw the river breach its banks, figured there might be folks needing help." "Lillian Evans," she managed, her teeth beginning to chatter from cold and shock. "And I'm much obliged to you, Mr. Ellis. Let's get you somewhere dry, Mrs. Evans," he said, turning his horse toward the road that led to River Bend. "You can tell me what happened once you're warm." As they rode away from the devastation, Lillian couldn't help but look back one last time. 3 years of work, of memories both bitter and sweet, now lay beneath the uncaring waters of the Colorado. She felt empty, hollowed out like the riverbanks themselves. "It'll be all right, madam," Vaughn Ellis said quietly, seeming to sense her despair. "Ain't nothing that can't be rebuilt." Lillian didn't respond. What did this cowboy know of loss? Of starting over with nothing but the clothes on your back and a satchel of trinkets that held no practical value? Yet she found herself drawing comfort from his solid presence as they rode toward town through the relentless rain. By the time they reached River Bend, the storm had begun to abate, though the damage was evident everywhere. The town's main street had become a river of mud, with shopkeepers and residents working frantically to divert water from their establishments. Vaughn guided his horse directly to the River Bend Hotel, a two-story structure that stood as the settlement's most impressive building. "Martha," he called as they dismounted under the hotel's covered porch. "Got a lady here who's lost everything to the flood." A stout woman in her 50s appeared at the door, her eyes widening at the sight of Lillian's bedraggled form. "Lord have mercy," Martha exclaimed, ushering Lillian inside. "Come in, dear, come in. We'll get you dry and warm in no time." Lillian allowed herself to be led into the hotel's small lobby, suddenly overwhelmed by the events of the day. Her knees buckled, and she might have fallen if Vaughn hadn't caught her arm. "Easy now," he murmured, guiding her to a chair near the pot-bellied stove that dominated the room. The heat from the fire washed over her, making her realize just how cold and wet she truly was. "It's the Evans homestead," Vaughn explained to Martha. "River took a new course right through her property, nothing left standing when I got her out." Martha clicked her tongue sympathetically. "You poor dear, let me find you some dry clothes. My daughter's about your size." She bustled away, leaving Lillian with Vaughn in the warm lobby. "Thank you," Lillian said softly, looking up at the man who had saved her life. In the light of the hotel, she could see him more clearly, tall and broad-shouldered, with the lean build of a man who spent his days in hard physical labor. His dark hair was damp and curling slightly at the ends, and several days' worth of stubble shadowed his jaw. "No need for thanks," Vaughn replied, removing his hat and running a hand through his wet hair. "Anyone would have done the same." "Perhaps," Lillian said, "but it was you who came, Mr. Ellis." A hint of color touched his tan cheeks. "Vaughn, please, Mr. Ellis was my father." "Then I insist you call me Lillian," she replied, surprising herself with the informality. Perhaps it was the shock, or maybe the fact that formalities seemed trivial when you've just lost everything. "Lillian," he repeated, as if testing how the name felt on his tongue. Martha returned with an armful of clothing and a towel. "Here you are, dear. There's a room you can change in just down the hall, first door on the right. I've put on some coffee, too." Lillian accepted the dry clothes gratefully and retreated to the indicated room. As she peeled off her sodden dress and petticoats, the reality of her situation hit her anew. She was now completely destitute, with no home, no livelihood, and only a few saved treasures to her name. The tears she had been holding back finally came, silent and hot on her cheeks as she dressed in the borrowed clothes, a simple blue dress that was slightly too large but blessedly dry. When she emerged, composed but red-eyed, she found Vaughn standing by the stove, a steaming mug in his hand. He had removed his duster, revealing a faded red flannel shirt tucked into worn denim trousers. He too had changed, or at least dried somewhat, his hair now merely damp instead of dripping. "Coffee," he offered, extending a second mug toward her. Lillian accepted it gratefully, wrapping her cold fingers around the warm ceramic. "Do you live in town, Mr. Vaughn?" He shook his head. "Got a small ranch about 5 miles east, nothing fancy, just enough land for some cattle and horses." He took a sip of his coffee before adding, "Been here about 4 years now." "That's longer than I've been in the territory," Lillian said. That is, my husband and I came out from Missouri 3 years ago. He passed shortly after we arrived." She didn't know why she was telling him this. Perhaps it was simply the need to affirm that she had existed before this moment, that she had a history the river couldn't wash away. "I'm sorry to hear that," Vaughn said, and the simple sincerity in his voice made her throat tighten again. Martha returned, carrying a tray laden with bread, cheese, and sliced apple. "You need to eat something, dear," she insisted, setting it down on a small table. Shock takes it out of a body. Lillian hadn't thought she could eat, but the sight of food awakened a fierce hunger in her. She realized she hadn't eaten since early morning before the waters began to rise. "The McCreadys lost their barn," Martha continued, clearly the town's source of information, "and the Wilsons' fields are underwater. Sheriff says the bridge to Prescott might be washed out too." "Any other homesteads take damage," Vaughn asked, his eyes flicking briefly to Lillian. None as bad as Mrs. Evans here from what I've heard, Martha replied. The Thompsons had some water in their root cellar, and old Mr. Peterson's prize bull got himself stranded on what amounts to an island now. But they'll manage. Lillian felt a perverse sort of pride at being the most affected, followed immediately by shame at such a thought. What am I to do now? She wondered aloud, not really expecting an answer. You'll stay here tonight, of course, Martha said firmly. No charge, we take care of our own in River Bend. That's very kind, but I can't impose nonsense, Martha interrupted. It's decided. And tomorrow we'll figure out the next step. Vaughn had been quiet, seemingly lost in thought. Now he spoke up. Your land is at a complete loss, Lillian considered the question. The cabin is gone, certainly, and the garden, but the property itself. She tried to visualize the contours of her land, to imagine what it might look like now with the river cutting through it. I suppose most of it is still there, just rearranged. Might be worth riding out tomorrow to assess the damage, Vaughn suggested. If you'd like company, I could take you. Before Lillian could respond, the hotel door opened, admitting a gust of damp air and a tall man in a marshal's badge. Evening, Martha, he nodded to the proprietress before his eyes settled on Lillian. Mrs. Evans, heard about your place. Terrible business, Marshal Grant, Lillian acknowledged. She had met the lawman several times during her trips to town for supplies. Got the telegraph working again, Marshal Grant continued. Reports coming in from up and down the territory. Looks like the worst of the flooding is past, but there's considerable damage. Anyone hurt? Vaughn asked. No fatalities reported, thank the Lord. Some injuries, livestock losses, property damage. The marshal removed his hat, revealing thinning gray hair. Mrs. Evans, I'm afraid your homestead took the brunt of it in these parts. The river's carved itself a new channel right through your claim. Though she had seen it with her own eyes, hearing it stated so officially made Lillian's heart sink. Is there any recourse, any assistance available? Marshal Grant's expression was sympathetic but not encouraging. Territory's stretched thin as it is. Might be some disaster relief coming from back east, but I wouldn't count on it arriving anytime soon, if at all. Lillian nodded, having expected as much. The Arizona Territory was still raw and untamed, with little in the way of government infrastructure. People largely had to fend for themselves. I appreciate your candor, Marshal, she said, striving to maintain her dignity despite the circumstances. You've got friends here, Mrs. Evans, the lawman assured her. Folks will help out. After the marshal left, Lillian found herself suddenly exhausted, the adrenaline of the day giving way to bone-deep weariness. Martha, noticing her drooping shoulders, immediately took charge. That's enough for one day, she declared. You need rest. I've prepared room 3 for you. It's small but comfortable. I should be going as well, Vaughn said, draining the last of his coffee. Got animals to tend to. He turned to Lillian, his expression earnest. My offer stands about tomorrow. I'll come by around mid-morning if you'd like to see your land. Lillian found herself nodding. Yes, I would appreciate that very much, thank you. As Martha showed her to the small but indeed comfortable room on the second floor, Lillian tried to process everything that had happened. In the span of hours, she had lost her home and been rescued by a stranger who now offered further assistance. The world had turned upside down, yet here she was, still standing. She placed her satchel, the only possession she had managed to save, on the bed and carefully unpacked its contents. A daguerreotype of her parents, her wedding band, a small Bible, a handkerchief embroidered by her mother, and a pouch containing the $37.12 that constituted her entire financial worth. Not much to show for 24 years of life, Lillian thought ruefully, but it was something. And tomorrow she would see what remained of her land. Perhaps, just perhaps, there would be a way forward. With that thought offering a slender thread of hope, Lillian extinguished the lamp and surrendered to exhaustion. The morning dawned clear and brilliant, the storm having spent its fury during the night. Lillian woke to sunlight streaming through her window and the distant sounds of River Bend coming to life. For a moment, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings, she reached for James beside her, then reality crashed back. James was 3 years gone, and now her home was gone too. She dressed quickly in yesterday's borrowed clothes, which Martha had somehow managed to press while Lillian slept. After a simple breakfast of biscuits and coffee in the hotel's small dining room, during which several townspeople stopped by to offer condolences and support, Lillian found herself on the hotel's porch, watching for Vaughn's arrival. He appeared precisely at mid-morning, as promised, riding a sturdy bay gelding and leading a dappled gray mare. He had shaved, Lillian noticed, and wore a clean blue shirt beneath his leather vest. His dark hair was tamed beneath his hat, and he greeted her with a nod that was almost shy. "Morning, Lillian," he said, dismounting. "Thought you might prefer riding to walking, given the state of the roads." "That's very thoughtful," she replied, eyeing the gray mare with some trepidation. She had ridden before, of course, but not often and never astride as would be necessary on these rugged trails. "I should warn you, I'm not much of a horsewoman. Marigold here is gentle as a lamb," Vaughn assured her, patting the mare's neck, "and we'll take it slow." With his help, Lillian mounted the gray horse, arranging her skirts as modestly as possible while sitting astride. The mare stood patiently, seemingly unbothered by her inexperienced rider. Their journey to Lillian's property took them through town and along the river road, where evidence of the flood's destruction was everywhere. Fields lay under inches of silt, fences were down, and debris littered the landscape. But already, people were at work repairing, rebuilding, clearing away the damage left by the waters. "Folks out here are resilient," Vaughn commented as they rode. "Nature throws its worst and they just pick up and start again. Is that what you did?" Lillian asked, curious about this quiet man who had appeared like a guardian angel in her moment of need. A shadow passed over his features. "Something like that," he said, and though his tone was light, Lillian sensed a story behind his words. Before she could inquire further, however, they crested a small rise and her former homestead came into view. The sight stole her breath. Where once a neat cabin had stood amid carefully tended gardens, now lay a swath of destruction. The river, previously confined to a channel 100 yards to the east, had carved a new path directly through her property. Her cabin was entirely gone, with not even the foundation stones remaining. Trees had been uprooted, the garden obliterated, the chicken coop and small barn nothing but scattered lumber downstream. But what struck Lillian most was how the land itself had been transformed. The flood had deposited rich silt across parts of her property, while scouring others down to bedrock. The new river channel curved gracefully through what had been her eastern field, creating a peninsula of high ground where none had existed before. "It's different," she managed finally, unable to articulate the complex emotions the sight evoked. Vaughn said nothing, simply allowing her time to absorb the changed landscape. After a few minutes, he gently urged his horse forward, and Lillian followed, descending toward what remained of her homestead. They spent the next hour exploring the property on horseback, assessing what had been lost and what might be salvaged. Very little of Lillian's possessions remained: a cast iron skillet half buried in mud, the wagon wheel from her garden gate wedged against a boulder, oddments of household goods scattered across the new riverbank. "The soil here is still good," Vaughn observed as they dismounted on the high peninsula. He crouched, rubbing the dark earth between his fingers. "Better, maybe, with the river silt mixed in. You could rebuild here above the new flood line." Lillian looked at him in surprise. "Rebuild? How could I possibly afford to rebuild?" Vaughn stood, dusting his hands on his jeans. "Folks around here help each other out. Barn raisings, cabin building, it's how communities survive out here. Even for a widow woman with nothing to offer in return," Lillian asked skeptically. "Especially for those who need it most," he replied, his blue eyes steady on hers. For the first time since the flood, Lillian felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps it wasn't all lost. The land was still hers, after all, and in some ways the new river access might even be an improvement, offering easier irrigation for crops. "I wouldn't know where to begin," she admitted. "Well," Vaughn said, looking thoughtfully at the peninsula, "first thing would be clearing this area and leveling a spot for a cabin. Then gathering materials: lumber, nails, window glass. The work itself isn't complicated, just labor-intensive." You sound like you've done this before, Lillian observed. Built my own place, he confirmed with a slight nod, and helped raise a few others around the territory. A thought occurred to Lillian then, so bold she almost didn't dare voice it, but what did she have to lose? Would you? Would you be willing to help me rebuild? I can't pay much, but I could cook for you, mend your clothes, whatever would be fair compensation. Vaughn studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to Lillian's surprise, a slow smile spread across his face, the first real smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his features, softening the weathered lines and lighting up his blue eyes. I reckon I could do that, he said simply. Been meaning to take on a new project anyway. Relief flooded through Lillian, followed quickly by a rush of determination. She had lost everything once before when James died and had managed to build a life for herself. She could do it again. When can we start? She asked. Vaughn chuckled at her eagerness. No time like the present for clearing land. But first, we should get some proper plans drawn up. No sense building without a solid idea of what you want. They spent another hour walking the property, with Vaughn pointing out the best location for a new cabin, considering factors like drainage, sun exposure, and protection from the elements. Lillian found herself impressed by his practical knowledge and attention to detail. The original cabin was just a single room with a loft, she explained as they discussed possibilities. It served me well enough, but you'd like something a bit more substantial this time, Vaughn suggested. Lillian nodded, somewhat embarrassed by her ambition. Is that foolish? Wanting more when I've just lost everything? Not foolish at all, he assured her. Man doesn't plant an orchard expecting only one season of fruit. You're building for your future. His words lingered with her as they rode back to town, discussing materials and timelines. By the time they reached the hotel, Lillian had a clearer vision of what might be possible. The loss still ached, but alongside it grew a tentative excitement about what could be built from the ruins. I'll speak with some folks in town, Vaughn said as he helped her dismount. See what materials might be available, who might be willing to lend a hand. If the weather holds, we could start clearing land tomorrow. I don't know how to thank you, Lillian said, impulsively touching his arm. You've been so kind to a virtual stranger. Something flickered in Vaughn's eyes, an emotion Lillian couldn't quite name. We're not strangers anymore, he said quietly. Then, with a tip of his hat, he mounted his bay and rode away, leading Marigold behind him. Lillian watched him go, a curious warmth spreading through her chest despite the uncertainty of her circumstances. For the first time since the flood, she felt something beyond grief and shock. She felt possibility. True to his word, Vaughn returned the next morning with tools, supplies, and a rough sketch of a cabin design for Lillian's approval. To her surprise, he had also brought two local men brothers named Sam and Daniel Cooper who had volunteered to help with the initial clearing work. Mrs. Evans, the elder Cooper nodded respectfully. Sorry about your place. Vaughn here says you're looking to rebuild, and well, our pa always taught us to lend a hand where it's needed. Over the next week, a routine developed. Each morning, Vaughn would arrive at the hotel, sometimes with additional volunteers, sometimes alone. They would ride to Lillian's property and work until midday, when Lillian would prepare a simple meal from provisions Vaughn brought along. After eating, they would work until dusk, then return to town. The work was grueling but satisfying. They cleared fallen trees, removed debris, and leveled the building site on the peninsula. Lillian worked alongside them, gathering smaller pieces of debris, sorting through recovered items, and keeping everyone fed and watered. By the end of the first week, the foundation area was marked out a rectangle 24 feet by 16 feet, considerably larger than her original cabin. Divided into 2 rooms, Vaughn explained as they stood looking at the staked outline one evening. Living area with kitchen here, bedroom there, plus a loft above for storage or guests, porch across the front facing the river. It sounds wonderful, Lillian said, trying to envision it. Almost $2,000. Vaughn smiled, his face bronzed by the setting sun. Not $2,000 at all, just right for starting over. As they prepared to leave that evening, Lillian noticed Vaughn eyeing the river thoughtfully. Something on your mind, she asked. Just thinking we might salvage some of your foundation stones from the old cabin, he replied. River's lower now, and I spotted some downstream. Good stones valuable out here. The next day, Vaughn arrived alone, wearing older clothes and carrying rope and grappling hooks. Cooper boys had other commitments, he explained. Thought we might work on recovering those stones today. They spent the morning wading in the shallows of the new river channel, retrieving the squared stones that had once formed the base of Lillian's cabin. It was wet, muddy work, but oddly enjoyable. Lillian found herself laughing as she slipped on mossy rocks, and even Vaughn seemed more relaxed, his usual reserve softening in the face of their shared task. By midday, they had recovered nearly 24 stones, enough to make a significant start on the new foundation. Soaked and mud splattered, they sat on the riverbank to eat the simple lunch Lillian had prepared. May I ask you something personal? Lillian ventured, emboldened by the easy companionship that had developed between them. Vaughn looked up from his bread and cheese, his expression guarded but not unwelcoming. You can ask. What brought you to the Arizona territory? You don't strike me as someone who was born out here. He was quiet for a long moment, and Lillian feared she had overstepped. But then he spoke, his voice lower than usual. I was a soldier. Union Army. After the war ended, I drifted west, couldn't settle back into normal life back east. His eyes were focused on something distant, beyond the horizon. Too many ghosts. I'm sorry, Lillian said softly. That must have been difficult. Vaughn shrugged, but the casualness of the gesture seemed forced. Lot of men in the same boat. Some found solace in drink, some in violence. I found it in open spaces and honest work. He met her gaze then. What about you? What brought you and your husband out here? Dreams, I suppose, Lillian replied with a sad smile. James read about the Homestead Act, about free land for those willing to work it. We were young and full of grand ideas about building something of our own, away from the crowded cities. She looked out over the transformed landscape of her property. We never imagined he wouldn't live to see it happen. He was lucky to have had you to carry on the dream, Vaughn said quietly. Lillian felt tears prick at her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. Sometimes I wonder if I'm honoring his memory or just being stubborn. It would be easier to go back east, to family. Is that what you want? Vaughn's question held no judgment, only genuine curiosity. Lillian considered it seriously before answering. No, she said finally. No, this is my home now. This land, this territory, it's part of me. I want to stay and make something of it. Vaughn nodded, a hint of approval in his eyes. Then we'd best get back to work. Those stones won't move themselves. The days stretched into weeks as the work on Lillian's new cabin progressed. The foundation was laid with the recovered stones, supplemented by new ones hauled from a nearby quarry. Vaughn proved to be as skilled a builder as he was a rancher, directing the work with quiet confidence. Word of the project spread through the small community of River Bend, and occasionally new volunteers would appear, a farmer with a wagon of lumber to donate, a shopkeeper's wife with a basket of food, the blacksmith offering to forge hinges and latches at no charge. Lillian was overwhelmed by the generosity, especially from people she barely knew. I told you folks help each other out here, Vaughn reminded her when she expressed her amazement. Most of them have needed help themselves at one time or another. As June gave way to July, the frame of the cabin took shape. Sturdy pine logs formed the walls, notched and fitted with precision under Vaughn's guidance. Window openings were left on all four sides, promising more light than Lillian's previous home had enjoyed. Through it all, Vaughn was a constant presence. He would arrive at first light each day, work tirelessly until dusk, and then escort Lillian back to town. On days when other volunteers joined them, he coordinated their efforts efficiently. On days when he and Lillian worked alone, a comfortable rhythm developed between them, with few words needed as they passed tools back and forth or braced lumber for cutting. Lillian found herself watching him when he was focused on a task, the way his strong hands moved with surprising gentleness when fitting delicate window frames. The furrow of concentration between his brows as he measured and marked. The rare but transformative smile that appeared when a difficult section came together perfectly. She caught herself wondering about his life beyond their shared project. Did he have family somewhere? Had there been someone special in his past? The questions remained unasked, however, as Lillian was careful to maintain the respectful distance that propriety demanded. One sweltering afternoon in mid-July, as they were raising the final section of the cabin's roof, disaster nearly struck. Vaughn was balanced on the ridgepole, hammering roofing slats into place when one of the support braces shifted. The partially completed roof section swayed dangerously. "Vaughn!" Lillian cried in warning, rushing forward. He tried to catch his balance but slipped, tumbling down the steep pitch of the roof. Lillian watched in horror as he fell, landing hard on the ground with a sickening thud and a sharp cry of pain. "Vaughn!" She was at his side instantly, kneeling in the dirt. "Are you hurt? Can you move?" he grimaced, clutching his right arm to his chest. "Arm," he managed through gritted teeth. "Think it might be broken," Lillian's mind raced. They were alone at the property, 5 miles from town with only one horse between them. "I need to get you to the doctor," she said, forcing herself to remain calm. "Can you ride?" Vaughn nodded, his face pale beneath his tan. "Help me up." With Lillian's support, he managed to stand, though he swayed slightly from pain and shock. Getting him onto the horse proved challenging, but after several attempts, he was mounted, with Lillian walking alongside, leading the animal at a slow, careful pace toward town. The journey seemed interminable, with Vaughn growing increasingly pale and quiet as they progressed. By the time they reached Dr. Mitchell's small office on the edge of River Bend, Vaughn was barely conscious, slumping forward over the horse's neck. "Dr. Mitchell." Lillian called frantically as they approached. "Please, we need help." The next hours passed in a blur of anxiety. Dr. Mitchell confirmed that Vaughn's right arm was indeed broken, though thankfully a clean break that should heal well if properly set. The doctor also diagnosed 2 cracked ribs and multiple contusions, recommending complete rest for at least a week. "He can't go back to his ranch like this," Dr. Mitchell told Lillian as they stood outside the examination room. "He'll need care, someone to look after him while that arm heals enough for basic tasks." "He can stay at the hotel," Lillian suggested. "I'm still there myself, and I could help look after him." The doctor raised an eyebrow at this but simply nodded. "That would be suitable, I suppose. But be mindful of appearances, Mrs. Evans. Small towns breed big gossip." Lillian felt her cheeks flush. "I'm only repaying his kindness, doctor. He's done so much to help me rebuild." "Of course," Dr. Mitchell replied, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "I'll have him moved to the hotel once I've finished setting the arm and binding his ribs." That evening found Vaughn installed in a room across the hall from Lillian's at the River Bend Hotel, his right arm splinted and bandaged, his torso wrapped tightly to support his cracked ribs. He was conscious but groggy from the laudanum Dr. Mitchell had administered for pain. "This is humiliating," he muttered when Lillian brought him a tray with soup and bread. "I'm supposed to be helping you, not the other way around." "Consider it my turn to rescue you," Lillian replied lightly, though her heart still raced when she remembered the sight of him falling. "Besides, the cabin can wait a few days while you recover." Vaughn frowned. Work was progressing well, hate to lose momentum. "The roof won't run away," Lillian assured him, "and I'd rather have you healthy than have the cabin finished a week sooner." He looked at her then, a question in his blue eyes. "You've changed since the flood," he observed. "More confident," Lillian considered this. "Perhaps I have. Losing everything has a way of clarifying what matters, I suppose." She adjusted his pillow, keeping her hands busy to avoid meeting his gaze. "And having someone believe in my ability to rebuild helps too." "I never doubted it," Vaughn said quietly. The simple statement, delivered with such certainty, warmed Lillian more than she cared to admit. "You should eat before the soup gets cold," she said, changing the subject. "Doctor's orders." Over the next few days, Lillian divided her time between caring for Vaughn and making trips to her property to ensure the unfinished cabin was protected from the elements. To her surprise and gratitude, the Cooper brothers and several other townspeople continued work in Vaughn's absence, following his plans to complete the roof and begin on the interior walls. "They're doing it for him as much as for you," Martha confided as she helped Lillian prepare a tray for Vaughn's lunch. That young man has helped half the folks in this town at one time or another, though he'd never admit it. They're happy to return the favor. He's a good man, Lillian agreed, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks at Martha's knowing look. Indeed he is, the older woman replied. And a handsome one too, if you don't mind my saying so. Martha, Lillian protested, though without much conviction, just stating facts, dear. And the fact is, you could do a lot worse than a man who builds you a home with his own hands. Lillian had no response to that, so she simply took the tray and made her escape to Vaughn's room, where she found him sitting up in bed, looking distinctly restless. I'm going stir-crazy in here, he complained as soon as she entered. It's been 4 days, surely I can at least go downstairs. Dr. Mitchell said a week of rest, Lillian reminded him, setting down the tray, but I suppose sitting in the lobby wouldn't be too strenuous. Vaughn's face brightened. I'll take it, anything to get out of these 4 walls. After he ate, Lillian helped him dress, an awkward process given his splinted arm and bandaged ribs, but they managed with minimal embarrassment. She offered her arm for support as they made their way downstairs to the hotel's small lobby, where Vaughn sank gratefully into a chair near the window. Much better, he sighed, looking out at the bustling main street of River Bend. A man needs to see the sky every once in a while. Lillian smiled at his evident relief. I have news from the cabin, she told him. The roof is finished and they've started on the interior walls. Sam Cooper says they should be able to install the windows by the end of the week. Vaughn looked surprised, then pleased. That's good news. I was worried about losing time. The whole town seems determined to see the project through, Lillian said. Apparently, you've built up quite a reservoir of goodwill around here. He looked uncomfortable with the praise. Just being neighborly, he muttered. Well, your neighborliness means I might have a home before summer's end, Lillian replied. I'd call that extraordinary. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Marshal Grant, who entered the hotel looking grim. Mrs. Evans, Ellis. He nodded to them both. Good to see you up and about, Ellis, even if you do look like you tangled with a grizzly. What brings you by, Marshal? Vaughn asked, clearly sensing the lawman had news. Got word from Prescott, Grant said, lowering his voice. Group of men been hitting isolated homesteads between here and there. 3 places robbed in the last 2 weeks, 1 man killed trying to protect his property. Lillian felt a chill despite the summer heat. Bandits, here in River Bend, not yet, the marshal clarified. But they're moving this way, according to reports. I'm advising folks to be vigilant, especially those living outside town. Vaughn's expression had hardened. What about women living alone? His eyes flicked briefly to Lillian. Marshal Grant grimaced. They'd be particularly vulnerable, I'm afraid. I'd recommend staying in town until these men are caught, Mrs. Evans. But my cabin, Lillian began, can wait, Vaughn interrupted firmly. Your safety can't. The marshal nodded his agreement. We're organizing extra patrols, and I've telegraphed for assistance from Prescott, but it could be weeks before additional lawmen arrive. After the marshal left, a heavy silence fell between Lillian and Vaughn. The progress on her cabin, which had seemed so positive just moments before, now felt shadowed by this new threat. I won't be intimidated into abandoning my property, Lillian said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. These men could be anywhere in the territory. I can't put my life on hold indefinitely. No one's suggesting that, Vaughn replied, his tone gentle but firm, but there's a difference between courage and recklessness, Lillian. She met his gaze, surprised by the intensity she found there. You're worried about me. Of course I am, he said simply. I didn't pull you from a flood just to see you come to harm from some low-life bandits. The sincerity in his voice touched something deep within Lillian. Over the weeks they had worked together, Vaughn had become more than just a helper or even a friend. His steady presence had become a cornerstone in the new life. She was building a fact she had been reluctant to acknowledge even to herself. What do you suggest? She asked softly. Vaughn considered for a moment. We continue work on the cabin, but no one stays out there overnight, not until these bandits are caught, and no one, especially not you, goes out there alone. Lillian nodded slowly. That seems reasonable. And, he added, his expression softening slightly, once I'm healed enough, I'll stay at your property during the day while work continues. just as a precaution. Your arm will take weeks to fully heal, Lillian pointed out. You can't wield a hammer or an axe in that condition. No, Vaughn agreed, but I can still handle a rifle if it comes to that. The thought of violence at her homestead was deeply unsettling, but Lillian recognized the practical wisdom in Vaughn's suggestion. Very well, but only once Dr. Mitchell says you're fit enough to leave the hotel. Deal, Vaughn agreed with a slight smile. The next few days passed in an uneasy rhythm. Lillian continued to divide her time between caring for Vaughn and supervising work at the cabin site, always ensuring she was accompanied by at least one of the Cooper brothers or another town volunteer. The work progressed steadily. Windows were installed, interior walls framed, a stone fireplace and chimney began to take shape. By the end of the week, Dr. Mitchell declared Vaughn well enough to resume light activities, though heavy labor was still prohibited. True to his word, Vaughn began accompanying Lillian to the cabin site each day, though he clearly chafed at his inability to participate fully in the construction. I feel useless, he complained one afternoon as he watched Sam Cooper and two other men installing the cabin's front door. Standing around while others do the work. You've done more than your share already, Lillian reminded him, and your presence here is valuable even if you can't swing a hammer. Indeed, Vaughn had taken on the role of overseer, his keen eye for detail ensuring that the cabin was being built to his exacting standards. And though he didn't speak of it openly, Lillian knew he kept his rifle close at hand, his attention often straying to the surrounding landscape in watchful vigilance. As July turned to August, the cabin neared completion. The exterior was finished, with a sturdy door and glass windows, a luxury Lillian had not expected but deeply appreciated. Inside, the two rooms were taking shape, with smooth plank flooring and whitewashed walls. The loft above was accessible by a ladder, offering additional space for storage or guests. It's beautiful, Lillian told Vaughn as they stood in the main room one evening, watching the sunset through the western window. Far better than what I lost. I don't know how I'll ever repay you and everyone who helped. You don't need to repay kindness, Vaughn said, his gaze fixed on the golden light spilling across the new floor. That's not how it works out here. Nevertheless, Lillian insisted, I am grateful, especially to you, Vaughn. You've been. She trailed off, unsure how to express the depth of her feelings. He turned to look at her then, his blue eyes intent. I've been what? A blessing, she said simply. When the flood came, I thought I'd lost everything, but in a way it brought me something too. It brought me you. The words hung in the air between them, more revealing than Lillian had intended. She felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she didn't look away from his gaze. Vaughn took a step toward her, his expression softening. Lillian, a shout from outside interrupted whatever he had been about to say. Riders coming, 3 men on horseback. Vaughn's expression instantly shifted, all warmth replaced by alert vigilance. He grabbed his rifle from where it leaned against the wall and moved to the window, positioning Lillian behind him. Stay inside, he instructed tersely. Cooper, Harrison to the east side. Davis, watch the back. The men who had been working on the cabin quickly took up defensive positions, their own weapons at the ready. Through the window, Lillian could see 3 riders approaching slowly from the direction of town, their horses picking their way along the newly cleared path to the cabin. Can you make them out? She asked Vaughn, her heart racing. He squinted against the setting sun. Not clearly, but wait. His posture relaxed slightly. That's Marshal Grant in the lead. The others. One looks like Jenkins from the general store, and I don't recognize the third. Relief washed over Lillian, followed quickly by curiosity. What would bring the marshal out to her property at this hour? As the riders drew nearer, Vaughn lowered his rifle and stepped outside to greet them, with Lillian close behind. Marshal Grant dismounted first, his expression grim but with an undercurrent of satisfaction. Ellis, Mrs. Evans, he nodded to them both. Thought you'd want to know right away. We caught those bandits that have been terrorizing homesteads. Caught them? Where? Vaughn asked. About 10 miles west of here, the marshal replied. They made the mistake of hitting the Sanderson place. Old man Sanderson may be 70, but he can still shoot straight. Winged one of them, and they fled right into a patrol I'd set up along the western road. All three of them? Lillian asked, counting the riders. No, madam, 5 in total. 2 are already locked up in my jail. This here, he gestured to the third rider, whose hands Lillian now noticed were bound, is the last of them, taking him to join his friends now. The bound man glared sullenly from his horse, his face bruised and dirty. Lillian felt a shiver of revulsion, thinking about what might have happened had these men found her alone at her property. They'll face trial in Prescott next month, Marshal Grant continued. Given the murder at the Peterson place, likely they'll hang. But the important thing is, the threat's been neutralized. Folks can breathe easier now. That's good news indeed, Marshal, Vaughn said, though his stance remained wary as he eyed the captured bandit. Thought you'd want to know right away, Grant repeated. Especially with your cabin so near completion, Mrs. Evans, you'll be able to move in without worry now. The realization struck Lillian suddenly her home was almost ready, and now the shadow of danger had been lifted. She could begin her new life in earnest. Thank you, Marshal, she said sincerely. That's a weight off my mind. After the Marshal and his companions departed, taking the surly prisoner with them, an almost festive mood descended on the cabin site. The men who had been helping with construction broke out a bottle of whiskey someone had stashed in a toolbox, passing it around in celebration of both the cabin's near completion and the elimination of the bandit threat. Amid the good-natured revelry, Lillian found herself standing somewhat apart, watching as Vaughn spoke with the Cooper brothers, his gestures animated despite his injured arm. He had changed over the weeks she had known him, becoming less reserved, more willing to share his thoughts and even occasional smiles. Or perhaps, Lillian reflected, it was not that he had changed, but that she had come to see beyond the quiet exterior to the man beneath a man of integrity, skill, and unexpected tenderness. As if sensing her gaze, Vaughn looked up, meeting her eyes across the room. Something passed between them, unspoken but palpable, before Sam Cooper claimed his attention again. The celebration wound down as dusk deepened, the workers departing for town with promises to return the next day for the final touches. Soon, only Lillian and Vaughn remained, standing on the newly completed front porch of the cabin. It's really happening, Lillian said, looking out over her transformed property. In the fading light, she could see the outline of the garden she had started to replant, the cleared area where she planned to rebuild the chicken coop. And beyond, the graceful curve of the river that had both destroyed and renewed her land. You'll be able to move in by week's end, Vaughn confirmed, leaning against a porch post. Just need to finish the fireplace and do some final sealing around the windows. And then what? Lillian asked, the question slipping out before she could consider its implications. Vaughn looked at her, his expression questioning. And then you'll have your home back. Isn't that what we've been working toward? Yes, of course, Lillian said quickly. I just meant, after this project is complete, what will you do next? Back to my ranch, I suppose, he replied, though he sounded strangely uncertain. Got cattle that need tending, fences that need mending. Of course, Lillian nodded, trying to ignore the hollowness that opened inside her at the thought of Vaughn returning to his own life, their daily interactions coming to an end. A silence fell between them, not the comfortable silence of shared work, but a charged one, filled with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Vaughn straightened, adjusting his hat. We should head back to town before it gets fully dark. The ride back was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. At the hotel, Vaughn helped Lillian dismount with his good arm, the brief contact sending a flutter through her stomach that she tried desperately to ignore. Good night, Lillian, he said softly, his blue eyes searching hers in the lamplight spilling from the hotel windows. Good night, Vaughn, she replied, and thank you for everything today. He nodded once, then led his horse toward the livery stable where he had been boarding it during his convalescence. Lillian watched him go, 1,000 words caught in her throat, none of them appropriate to call after a man in the middle of River Bend's Main Street. The final days of work on the cabin passed in a blur of activity. True to Vaughn's prediction, by the end of the week, the structure was complete, a solid, beautiful home that far exceeded Lillian's original modest dwelling. The main room featured a stone fireplace with a cooking area, a table and chairs donated by the widow Harmon, and shelves built into the walls for storage. The bedroom, though small, had space for a bed and a chest of drawers, with a window that caught the morning sun. Above, the loft had been floored and furnished with a small pallet for guests. "It's ready," Vaughn announced on Friday afternoon as he hung the last of the shutter's decorative touches he had insisted on adding despite Lillian's protests that they were an unnecessary luxury. "You can move in whenever you'd like." Lillian stood in the center of the main room, turning slowly to take it all in. "I can hardly believe it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. 2 months ago, I watched my home wash away, and now. "And now you have a new beginning," Vaughn finished for her. The words sparked a memory Vaughn pulling her from the floodwaters, telling her that she was alive. That was what mattered most. He had been right, of course. But standing in this new home he had helped create, Lillian realized that surviving was only part of the story. It was what came after survival, the rebuilding, the community, the unexpected connections that gave life its richness. "I'd like to move in tomorrow, if that's not too soon," she decided. "I've imposed on Martha's hospitality long enough. Tomorrow it is," Vaughn agreed. "I'll bring the wagon to transport your things." Her things were few, the contents of her satchel, some clothing donated by townswomen, and a few household items she had purchased or been given over the past weeks. But Martha and several other women from town had been collecting items for her new home: linens, cookware, dried foods to stock her pantry. It would be enough to start with. The next morning dawned clear and warm, a perfect late summer day. Lillian woke early, too excited to sleep, and packed her meager possessions. By the time Vaughn arrived with the wagon, she was ready, standing on the hotel porch with Martha beside her. "You take care out there on your own," Martha fussed, adjusting Lillian's shawl unnecessarily. "And don't be a stranger in town, you hear? Come visit an old woman now and then." "I will," Lillian promised, embracing the older woman who had become a dear friend, "and you're welcome at my new home anytime." The journey to the cabin was filled with a nervous excitement for Lillian. This was truly happening. She was going home. Not to the home she had lost, but to something new, something built from disaster and determination. When they arrived, Lillian was surprised to see several wagons already there and a small crowd of people milling about on her porch and in the yard. "What's all this?" she asked Vaughn, who looked suspiciously unsurprised by the gathering. "Housewarming," he said simply, helping her down from the wagon. "Folks wanted to welcome you properly to your new home." It was overwhelming and wonderful. Women from town had prepared a feast, which was laid out on trestle tables under the trees. Men had brought final gifts for the house: a rocking chair, tools for the garden, a young milk cow tethered discreetly behind the cabin. Children ran about playing games, their laughter mingling with the murmur of adult conversation and the gentle sound of the river that now curved so beautifully past the property. Lillian moved through the gathering in a daze of gratitude, accepting congratulations and gifts, trying unsuccessfully to express the depth of her appreciation. These people, many of whom she had barely known before the flood, had come together to help her rebuild not just a house, but a life. And through it all, Vaughn was there, quietly ensuring everything ran smoothly, accepting thanks on behalf of the building crew, his injured arm now in a simple sling rather than the more restrictive splint. Watching him interact with her guests, Lillian realized how deeply he was respected in the community and how much his advocacy had contributed to the outpouring of support she had received. As the afternoon waned, guests began to depart, leaving with final good wishes and promises to visit. By sunset, only Vaughn remained, helping Lillian arrange the last of her new possessions inside the cabin. "I can't believe how generous everyone has been," Lillian said as she placed a hand-sewn quilt on her new bed, a gift from a group of women who met regularly to sew together. "I'll never be able to repay them. That's not how community works," Vaughn reminded her, carefully hanging a small mirror on the wall. "Someday you'll be the one helping when someone else is in need." Lillian nodded, accepting the truth of his words. "Still, I owe you a special debt, Vaughn. None of this would exist without you. He turned from the wall, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. "You don't owe me anything, Lillian. I didn't do it to create a debt." "Why did you do it then?" she asked softly. The question hung between them, weighted with all that had remained unspoken during their weeks of working side by side. Vaughn seemed to struggle with his answer, his eyes moving from Lillian to the window and back again. "At first," he said finally, "it was just the right thing to do. Someone in need, skills I could offer." He paused, running his hand along the smooth wood of the doorframe wood he had planed and fitted himself. But then it became something more. Lillian's heart quickened. More. Vaughn met her gaze directly now, his blue eyes intense. "I've been alone a long time, by choice mostly. After the war, I didn't want connections, didn't want to risk caring about people who could be taken away." He took a step toward her. "But working with you, seeing your courage, your determination, it changed something in me." "Vaughn," Lillian whispered, hardly daring to hope she understood his meaning correctly. "I know it's forward of me," he continued, the words coming more quickly now as if he feared losing his nerve. "You're just getting settled, just finding your footing again." "The last thing you need is you," Lillian interrupted, closing the distance between them. "You're exactly what I need, Vaughn Ellis." His eyes widened, hope and uncertainty warring in his expression. "Lillian, I'm not a wealthy man. My ranch is modest, my prospects limited. Do you think I care about that?" she asked, bold in a way she had never been before. "I've lost enough to know what matters, and what matters is having someone who sees your strength when you feel weak, who believes in your future when all seems lost." She reached up, touching his face gently. "Someone who would build you a home with his own hands." The last of Vaughn's reserve crumbled. He leaned down, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence and pressed his lips to hers. Lillian responded with all the emotion that had been building within her over the week's gratitude, admiration, and yes, love for this quiet man who had become the foundation of her new life. When they finally broke apart, Vaughn rested his forehead against hers, his good arm encircling her waist. "I never expected this," he murmured. "When I pulled you from that flood, I never imagined that you were rescuing your future," Lillian suggested with a small smile. Vaughn chuckled, the sound warm and rich. "Something like that, yes." As darkness fell outside, they lit lamps in Lillian's new home, their soft glow illuminating the space they had created together. There was still much to discuss, plans to make, a future to envision. But for now, it was enough to sit together on the porch, watching the stars emerge above the river that had both destroyed and ultimately enriched their lives. "What do you think about adding a second bedroom?" Vaughn asked casually, his arm around Lillian's shoulders. "For the future, I mean." Lillian leaned into his embrace, a deep contentment spreading through her. "I think that sounds perfect." 1 year later, the cabin on the peninsula had evolved into a true home. The garden Lillian had replanted now flourished, producing vegetables in abundance. Chickens clucked contentedly in a new coop, and the milk cow grazed peacefully in a fenced pasture. Inside, the once bare walls were adorned with simple decorations, dried flowers, a sampler Lillian had embroidered during the winter evenings, a landscape painting gifted by a traveling artist in exchange for meals and lodging, and there were new additions. A lean-to workshop attached to the east side of the cabin, where Vaughn could work on woodcraft projects, a small stable for their horses, and most significantly, a cradle in the corner of their bedroom, awaiting the child that would arrive before winter. Lillian stood on the porch, one hand resting on her swollen belly, watching as Vaughn repaired a section of garden fence that had been damaged during a recent thunderstorm. The sight of him working on their land, their shared home, still filled her with wonder and gratitude. After their declaration of love that first evening in the new cabin, things had moved quickly. A brief courtship, conducted under the watchful but approving eyes of the River Bend community, had led to a simple wedding ceremony performed by the circuit preacher in October. Vaughn had moved his modest herd of cattle to Lillian's property, which offered better grazing than his former ranch. Together, they had weathered their first winter as husband and wife, snug in the cabin he had built, planning for the future they would share. Now, as summer once again heated the Arizona landscape, that future was expanding in ways they had both dreamed of but hardly dared to hope for. Their small ranch was prospering, their cattle herd growing. The town of River Bend was expanding too, with a new schoolhouse under construction, a project Vaughn had naturally been drafted to assist with, given his proven building skills. And soon, very soon, they would become parents. As if sensing her gaze, Vaughn looked up from his work, offering a smile that still made Lillian's heart flutter. He set down his hammer and walked toward her, wiping his brow with a bandana. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his eyes moving tenderly over her face, noting the slight flush from the summer heat. "Wonderful," Lillian replied honestly. "A bit unwieldy," she added with a laugh, gesturing to her prominent belly, "but wonderful nonetheless." Vaughn placed his hand gently over hers, feeling the movement of their child beneath. "He's active today," he observed. "She," Lillian corrected with a teasing smile, continuing their ongoing, good-natured debate about the baby's gender. "Either way," Vaughn said softly, leaning down to kiss her, "he or she will be the most loved child in the territory." Lillian returned his kiss, then gazed out at the river flowing peacefully past their home. How strange that the force that had once destroyed her life had ultimately led her to such happiness. The river had taken everything, but in doing so, it had cleared the way for something far greater than she could have imagined. "I was thinking," she said, leaning against Vaughn's strong shoulder, "that we might name the baby James, if it's a boy, after my first husband." She felt Vaughn stiffen slightly beside her and hurried to explain. "Not because I'm still holding on to the past, but because without him I wouldn't have come west, wouldn't have been here when the flood came, wouldn't have met you." Vaughn relaxed, understanding in his eyes. "And if it's a girl?" Lillian smiled, looking out at the water that had forever changed the course of their lives. "River," she said simply, "for the force that brought us together." Vaughn's arm tightened around her shoulders. "River Ellis," he said, testing the name. "I like it." As they stood together on the porch of the home they had built from disaster and hope, Lillian felt a completeness she had never known before. The river had risen and swept away her home, but the cowboy who had come to her rescue had built her a new one with his own hands, and in doing so, had helped her build a life more rich and full than she had ever dared to dream possible.